So first of all, to welcome you all, and thank you all for coming out on such a miserable day. I woke up this morning and looked at my curtain and I thought, oh God, is anybody going to show up today? But it's good to see such a full room. So we've got a busy morning, so I'm not going to spend too much time doing introductions and things like that, but there's just a couple of things I want to let people know, because people kind of come and go throughout the day. So just whilst we have most people here, I just wanted to let you know a little bit about the National Parents Council. My name's Anya Lynch and I'm the CEO of the National Parents Council. And we do lots of services and training and helpline and advocacy for parents of children in primary schools. There's another National Parents Council for post-primary, and they do similar work for the post-primary parents at that level. But at primary schools we do, as I said, training, and we've got a helpline stand out there and a training stand out in the stand, so you can get more information about that. And that's general, and I'm always very aware when we do a conference like this for parents of children with special education needs, but you're also parents of children, so all of the other services that we do are equally useful and applicable to yourselves. So if you just want to go to the stand and find out the other work that we do, it's there, but also we have a website which is npc.ie, and there's a huge amount of information on that website. Not just about upcoming events like this, but also just general day-to-day stuff that you might need to support you whilst you're supporting your children in primary education. In terms of special education, we do a number of other pieces of work as well, and I suppose whilst we have you all in the room, we might just give you a little bit of a flavour of that. People who were here last year might remember that there was a presentation on a new allocation model for children, for giving resources to schools for children with special education needs. And NPC was represented on that working group. And that's now being piloted in a number of schools, and our speakers this morning may make reference to that. We're also on the consultation forum for the National Council for Special Education. So you'll hear a little bit more this morning about what the National Council is. But it just does mean that the parents' voice is heard at that level. So when there's different initiatives being talked about or discussed, or issues around special needs assistant provision, the National Parents Council does sit on a consultative forum on that. So we need to hear your voice as to what you need to have said at those forums. So in light of that, we also have a special interest group for parents of children with special education needs. It meets a number of times a year during term time. There's going to be a meeting of it after this conference. So any school that's a member of the National Parents Council, the Parents Association is a member of the National Parents Council, each member has an opportunity to send somebody to be representative on that special interest group for parents of children with special education needs. Now we have other special interest groups as well, and you can find out about those on the website, but just for this morning, just to kind of highlight the one for parents of children with special education needs. And so we write out to schools and invite them to those meetings, and we talk about policy issues to do with things that you're experiencing with your children, but it's also kind of looking at sharing supports as well. So obviously as a peer group, you often have an awful lot of information for each other that just is lost in the system somewhere. So it's an opportunity for that to happen as well. So I'm going to finish there, and I'm going to first of all introduce the first of our morning speakers, who is Shay Goulding. Shay's going to talk about, I'm going to let him introduce himself in terms of his role within the National Council for Special Education, but he's going to talk about the SNA role and what I suppose the role includes and involves, and then following that, Noelle's going to talk about how that role is allocated throughout the schools. So I'll introduce you to Shay. Thank you, Shay.
Thank you, Anya. Good morning, everybody. I'm Shay Goulding. I'm the Head of Operations in the National Council for Special Education, and my colleague Noelle is the Head of Local Services, and she's responsible for the delivery of services to schools. Normally a presentation like this will be made, the presentation I'm making will be made by the department, but they asked me if I could make it today. Unfortunately, they were able to attend, and so I'm going to outline to you the scheme, a presentation on what the SNA scheme is about, and to some extent what it's not about, and then Noelle will outline to you how the NCSE allocates SNAs within the remit of the scheme. Just a bit, as Anya said, just before we get into the scheme itself, like just in case some of you don't know what or who the National Council for Special Education are, we're a council which was set up by the department under legislation about, at this stage, 11 years ago, under the EPSN Act, or the Education for Persons with Special Educational Needs Act. And the Council's role is to improve the delivery of services to students in schools, to undertake research in the area of special education and the provision of supports to children with disabilities, and then sometimes using that research or sometimes just directly to engage in the development of policy advice to the Department of Education and Skills. Sometimes that advice, in fact most times, is underpinned by some research, although not all the research is designed to purely address policy issues. But we would, if you look at that in a circle, we're out there on the ground identifying, providing services to schools and identifying what's happening. We then also sort of widen the scope there by sort of undertaking specific research in particular areas, which can then in turn inform policy advice which we can present to the Minister. And as Anya mentioned, for example, the most recent piece of policy advice that we presented to the Minister was in relation to a new model of allocation of resource teaching to schools, which is being piloted. It's not the subject of this morning's discussion, but effectively it's changing the manner in which teaching supports will be allocated or could be allocated to schools. Instead of applications on a child-by-child basis, it would be on a sort of a block allocation to schools based on the school profile. And that's being piloted by the Department at this point in time in I think 47 or 48 schools. And there will be another piece of policy advice travelling to the Department shortly in relation to the provision of supports to children with autism. And most of the policy advice that we undertake is generally on request from the Department, because we operate under the Department's policy parameters, and sometimes within those parameters the Minister or the Department may ask us to provide them with policy advice in areas where they consider that they may need to consider change or they may need to re-examine how their policy is operating. So that's just a little bit about the Council. We would have, I think, 13 members on the Council who all would have a level of expertise in the area of disabilities drawn from, say, the National Disability Authority, from the school sector. The Minister appoints a number of nominees, and we have, and the Council is due to finish its current term, I think, next month. So there'll be a new Council appointed probably sometime in December by the Minister. And as you said, Anya, we have a consultative forum which meets up to 4 times a year, drawn from a wide sector. There's parents on it, there's schools, there's people from the representatives from the health sector, from the voluntary groups, etc. And they can be asked to provide the Council with advice when sometimes they're developing the policy or just in relation to a particular area of provision. And some of the areas that we might have looked at this year, for example, would have been in relation to the whole area relating to the establishment of special classes, because that has been quite a sort of, there's been a significant sort of number of classes established in the last few years, and we were just seeking advice or views on the operation of the classes, the need for them, etc. So we're there to work under the Department's policy, but we're there to also provide advice. We're independent while operating under that policy. So it means, for example, if we undertake research or policy advice, we'll publish it, put it out in the public domain. So it's not an internal process within the Department. And that's, to date, as I said, there's been quite a number of pieces of policy advice published. So, back to this morning's topic, presentation on the SNA scheme. What I'll do is, as I said, I'll outline to you on behalf of the Department how the scheme operates, what the policy parameters are, and then Noel will outline to you precisely how we sort of allocate the SNA supports within the remit of that policy. So, how old is the scheme? And I mean, I was looking at this a couple of years ago. I was surprised how long the SNA scheme has been on the go. Back in the late 1970s, there was a childcare assistance scheme set up for special schools, and I think back at that time there were 75 of these posts allocated to special schools. Then in 1993, the Special Education Review Committee, or SERC as is more commonly known, it was a complete review of the provision of special education supports in schools. Called for submissions. It was one of the first times, I think, that the Department actually operated a model like this of consultation and policy development. And in the submissions there was a lot of references to the need for additional S&A posts, as they were now being called, to be allocated to mainstream schools. So that was taken on board. The review published its report back in 1993, and elements of that report began to feed into the Department of Education and Skills policy and ultimately into its resource allocation process. And S&As began to appear in the mainstream school setting. And I think in 1998 then, Minister Micheál Martin announced that there would be a significant ramping up of supports to schools, and it was called the automatic response. So there was a formalised set of childcare supports for students with special educational needs. And that's when I can recall this, because I worked in the department at the time, I can recall the sense of, you could call it excitement, or the sense of commitment, and in relation to a dedicated approach to resourcing schools. Because prior to that there was you could argue that there might not have been as formalised a structure for applications or for processing or provision of support, should I say, to schools. It might have been handled by the inspectorate, who would have taken a particular view on what supports the school needed. But around that time they decided to put in place a specific sort of process, and that began to roll out from 1998. And of course, when you have a process like that in place, it then begins to sort of deal with the pent-up demand that had begun to emerge from schools. So we moved in to say the department's definition of the S&A scheme itself. It's a scheme which is there to provide supports with additional adult support staff who can assist children with special education needs who also have additional and significant care needs. And I put that sort of last sort of few words in italics, because that is the core element of the S&A scheme. It's designed to help schools assist children who have additional and significant care needs. It's not there to provide education supports. It's the care needs are designed, or the care needs supports, should I say, are designed to ensure that the education can take place in the school setting. But the S&A support is not a direct education support. And I'll be quite honest with you, that would be one of the areas where I see there's a blurring of the edges at times, and there's a confusion. But it's the basis on which we operate in the council. And Noel, as I said, will sort of explain a wee bit more about that. So, how has the scheme developed? Back in 1998, when the automatic response was announced, I think the figure was in the region of about 300 S&A. So back around, say, in when the scheme originally started, we said 75. It had increased to about 300, and there was a small amount in mainstream schools. It was mainly in special schools, because students in special schools would have had the most complex care needs. By 2001, it had, as you can see, increased significantly. By 2005, it had more than doubled again. And during that time, the department had a series of different allocation models in place. It was a very centralised process. Every school had to send their applications into the Department of Education's Special Education section in Athlone. And as a result, a backlog began to sort of emerge, because there would be about 3,300, 3,400 schools benefiting from S&A support. And all of these schools were seeking to know what was happening with the applications. The staff who were trying to process the applications were then answering phone calls trying to say what they were doing in relation to the applications. It became a vicious circle, because the applications began to the time scale began to move out further in terms of processing them, which led to more phone calls, etc. So by about 2004, when we were established, and as I said, it was one of the primary roles for the NCSE, the average length of time for processing an S&A application was out to 18 months. So it was taking an awful long time for applications to be sort of dealt with. It led to a huge pressure on the department. I think at the time, I remember when I started in this job, I said there wasn't a day when Liveline was dealing with special needs issues. And understandably so, because children were starting in junior infants, and it was possibly first class before they were getting a response in some cases. In 2010, as you can see, the numbers had increased to 10,575, or at that stage, because of the economic crisis that hit the country, caps or numbers on public servants were capped in every area of the public service, and they capped the numbers in special needs at 10,575. And over the last 5 years, the numbers have increased again, as you can see, by roughly 1,200, 1,300. And to some extent, there's been an awful lot, I even heard it this week on the media, about the cutbacks in SNA support. I mean, whether it's accepted or not, there are probably only about 2 or 3 areas in the whole of the civil and public service, that's your 280, 290,000 staff in the public service, where numbers have gone up over the last 4 to 5 years. In our organisation, for example, it's gone down by almost 20%, and yet we're required to maintain the same level of service, and we're doing that. We've reorganised ourselves to do that. But in relation to SNA supports, they've gone up, and they've gone up, as I said, roughly by about 10%. Now, you may argue as parents it's not enough. That's fair enough. I'm not going to sort of debate that with you. What I'm trying to put across is that, in fairness to the government or the system, I'm not trying to speak on behalf of the government, but there was a reflection that even in the worst time this country has ever faced, economically speaking, there was a commitment to meeting the needs of students with special education needs in schools, and it should be at least acknowledged. It may not be entirely accepted, but the fact is the numbers did go up over that period, and in fact we still have a small number of SNAs available to issue in emergency cases, and for example we have issued SNAs, for example, over the last couple of months, and will probably continue to do so. So it shows though, like, that in terms of a scheme, there's probably very few schemes like it in existence where it has expanded so much so quickly. And as I said, like, that in itself has brought issues in relation to perhaps the capacity for SNAs to be properly trained in some cases, because the demand was there so great, and there are training schemes available, but they probably wouldn't keep up with the pace of expansion. But it also shows, I think, to some extent, how the education sector, when the adult sort of care needs support was proposed as a support for students with special education needs, how the school system embraced, if you want to call it, the SNA scheme. Because I can remember in the early days, schools not really knowing how to sort of approach this scheme. I heard of situations at the very beginning where, for example, SNAs weren't let into the staff room because they weren't sure whether they were staff or not, because staff in schools were teachers and only teachers. And in some schools, some very small schools, you might have had situations where there were more SNAs than teachers in the school. So it changed, or the dynamic in some schools. But mainly in broad terms, like, the school sector saw this as a valuable support and have sought to access the support through the scheme over the last couple of years. The key department circular, and it's the one which I'm going to kind of go through very quickly and sort of in broad terms today, is the most recent circular which issued from the department to schools. It sets out the scheme. It's a long circular. It's about 25-30 pages, which is generally unusual for the department, because if you see most of their circulars, they're generally running from, say, 3 to 7 pages, because they just want to get a message across quickly to a school. But they wanted to set out to schools and to those who read circulars other than schools like ourselves, or if parents wanted to see them because they're all on the website, what the scheme was about, where it was, or where it was placed within the overall range of supports that are available to schools to meet the special education and care needs of students with special education needs. And it wanted to try and restate that in as clear language as it could, because it had recognised that there was a level of confusion around the terms of the scheme. So it is pointing out that there's adult support staff for schools to assist children with special education needs who also have significant care needs. It's pointing out that the SNA scheme facilitates attendance of students and minimises disruption to class teaching time. And then it's also saying that there should be a personal pupil plan developed for these students, because the SNA scheme is, in some cases, will meet care needs, not in all cases, but in a lot of cases. It will address care needs which may diminish over time as the student grows older or develops a level of independent living skills. So the level of dependency that exists in a child, say at age 4, may not be the same when the child reaches 8, 9, 10, 11, and in a lot of cases may not actually be there at all when the child is in second level. Conversely, there are some students who, by the time they go to second level with the onset of adolescence, some of the care needs may actually increase. And what they were trying to sort of put across in the circular was, well, look, if you plan what the targets are and how you're going to use the SNA support, you'll then determine year on year the extent to which the student will require access to SNA support on an ongoing basis. The circular then wanted to set out in more detail, because the previous circular, which had been the previous landmark circular, I think was dated in 2002, so it was quite old in terms of the development of the scheme, if you look at the numbers, etc. So it wanted to sort of set out, okay, what are the primary care needs that are addressed? And it sets it out there, as you can see: feeding, toileting and general hygiene, mobility, lifting, hoists, orientation. What that might mean, particularly in a second level context, is moving around the school, because as you know, there's an awful lot of movement at second level schools, but also it can apply in some of the larger primary schools as well. Assisting teachers with supervision, for example in the playground, because sometimes that's a very necessary aspect of it, because you're trying to ensure that the students are sort of socially integrating with the other students in the school, and the SNAs can be a valuable resource in that regard. Withdrawal from the class for safety reasons, if there's a behavioural issue, or for personal care. And in some cases, the administration of medicine. SNAs can be part of the school strategy. It's not purely an SNA duty per se. The school sometimes has a responsibility. They may to administer medicine. They'll have SNAs and in some cases teachers trained up as kind of backup. But SNAs can perform these duties because we recognise that there would be a number of students who would require medicine to be administered through the course of the school day. And then there are some, and this was the sort of the it was more explicit than in previous SNA circulars, students with severe communication difficulties, and they would be primarily students with visual or hearing impairments. And then it also talked about secondary care needs, which would be, for example, the preparation and tidying of workspaces and classrooms. So it was getting the class ready. That might have applied particularly in sort of a special class setting. Assistance with the preparation of personal pupil plans. So in other words, the SNA might be able to outline to the teachers precisely how the behaviour how the care needs are emerging, and the frequency and extent, and how they address them, so that the school can sort of integrate that into their personal pupil planning process. And then out of school activities. Again, as I said, from an inclusive approach, if the class is going off on a classroom activity, sort of a school trip or something, the SNAs can also sort of assist in that regard. But they've generally sort of signalled that the secondary care needs don't in themselves purely drive access to SNA support. It's the primary care needs that are the drivers of the scheme. The circular then made certain key statements. It said that the class teacher is responsible for the education of students with special educational needs, so that the class teacher is the primary support for all students, including students with special education needs. But in addition, there's a resource teaching support and a learning support in some cases can be allocated to a school to support the class teaching. So for some students with special educational needs, they may need and do need access to additional teaching support to ensure that they can learn, or their learning needs can be met in the class setting. And then for a subset of those students, or a smaller number, they will need SNA support to meet their care needs under the direction of the teacher. And again, my italics. And what I mean by that is it doesn't mean that every teacher is directing SNAs on a day-to-day basis exactly what to do. In some cases, and I've seen this in schools, that an SNA may come to the teacher and say, look, Shay this morning settled into his class a little easier than yesterday. I think we're okay in terms of him being able to sort of settle down in the class, etc. It means the teacher is broadly aware of how the care needs are being met. In some cases it might be more specific, but there's a balance achieved between the SNA support and the teaching support. But the SNA support isn't a completely standalone support which operates independently in the school. As I said, they have dedicated sort of a dedicated role, but again, it's part of the school community, and it's important that that sort of aspect of it is recognised by parents and by the school. More importantly, that it's not just leave them to their own devices, etc. So they're working under the direction of the class teacher, but that may be, as I said, a balance which is achieved between the class teacher and the SNA. The other thing that the circular sort of set out was almost like the sequencing of how we ultimately arrive at the level of support that a student may require. First and foremost, professional assessments indicate the care needs that a child may have. So in the diagnosis of disability, there will be references to certain care needs. And sometimes those care needs might be just one-liners: toileting, feeding, behaviour, etc. The school then, in sort of developing its case for the extent to which a student might require access to SNA support, would be setting out the frequency and extent of the care needs as they arise in a school setting. So really what we're saying is, like a good example would be, and I've seen these, like the examples I'm giving are ones that would have been given to me by schools, or I would have seen them when I'm in schools. You might have a student who has behaviour needs, and that's what's on the assessment. But it could be that the student, say for example with autism, might find that it's when the routine is changing, it's when they get a wee bit agitated. So you might have a student who's getting off a bus, going into a school or a class, and is finding that at that particular time there's a little edginess which might emerge in terms of behaviour. So the SNA support is required at that time to ensure that the child can sort of transition from the out of school setting to the in school setting. Then the class teacher takes over, and the behaviour mightn't actually emerge at all till towards the end of the class day. When again, I saw this once, that the bus was supposed to come at say 3 o'clock, but the bus was 5 minutes late, but the student knew it was 3 o'clock, it was supposed to be here, and then they began to get quite agitated thinking that the bus wasn't coming, and there was a need for a level of SNA support to sort of deal with the situation under the direction of the teacher until the bus came, and then everything was sort of back on track again. So the school sets out the frequency and extent of the care needs as they arise. The NCSE, or the CNO, and Noel will talk a wee bit more about this, is responsible for deciding on the quantum of SNA support to be allocated to the school to meet these care needs. So in other words, you might find a report which will say this child needs a full-time SNA. That statement isn't necessarily going to travel. That's not the job of the assessment. The school might say this child needs a full-time SNA. That may be the case in terms of how they're going to deal with through the allocation process, but the CNO is ultimately responsible for determining the level of SNA support that's allocated to the school. And I suppose just sticking with that for a moment, when this scheme started, the SNA was allocated to the child. And there was, I don't know if any of you can remember back prior to 2005, there was, the scheme that was in place said that Shay Goulding got his SNA, for example, and that's why we still have a residue of kind of references to my child's SNA, etc. What happened though in those situations was that if the SNA was tagged to a specific child, when the child left the school, the most senior SNA then was having to be let go in the school, because the contract effectively reflected support for a particular child, and the schools were beginning to lose their more experienced SNAs. So back around 2005, the system was kind of altered to ensure that the SNA support was allocated to the school, and the students accessed the SNA support. And that's where the last bullet point is very relevant. The responsibility for the management and deployment of the SNA support rests with the school. So they will receive their allocation of, let's say, 3-4 SNAs. And then they will determine through the class teachers, and as I said, the SNAs will feed into this as well, the extent to which they need to manage and deploy those SNAs. They'll obviously have plans. They'll know when the frequency and extent of the care needs as they generally arise. For example, if it's feeding, it might be around specific break times. Toileting, similarly, there's kind of patterns will emerge. Even with behaviour, there might be some patterns, albeit in certain cases there won't be. But the school is responsible for that aspect of it, and that, to a certain extent, within those 4 bullet points, sets out how the scheme works in essence, how the assessments are prepared, how the school then sets out the care needs, the frequency and extent of the care needs as they arise in a school setting, how the NCSE then will allocate a level of support to the school, and then how the school will manage and deploy that support. The circular also deals with one area of SNA support in particular, which is the behavioural care needs. And it's fair to say that I think at least 40% of SNA support allocated to schools would be allocated in relation to behaviour. And what we were finding was that at junior infants level, that little kids starting at school at age 4 were being labelled as children with extreme behavioural needs, effectively out of control kids, and they were being tagged on the day they went into school as children who were effectively at risk of significantly disrupting the class. And through the department's own sort of services such as NEPs, etc., it was determined like that, look, when kids come into class and they start in junior infants, it's a big change for all kids, all children, because they sometimes have to sit in the same place for an hour or 2 or even longer at times. There's a whole new routine being developed, and it's a new experience for all children. Teachers are very good at managing classes, and then they also have supports available through NEPS, the Education Psychological Service, to the Special Education Support Service, which is upskilling them in terms of class management and behaviour, etc. So what we were effectively saying was, look, an SNA support is available, but once the processes have been run to ensure that the behaviour is something which is very atypical, rather than just a couple of words on a professional report. And obviously, if there was a child who had got significant behavioural issues, it's highly likely that supports would have already been provided through the likes of the HSE, or at the very least they would be on a list of students who are awaiting treatment through the HSE. So therefore there's a process which is in place now, in particular for junior infants, that we wait to see how the school will address the behavioural issues, to see if the experience of the class teacher, the capacity to upskill the teacher, can meet those needs, or the access to the NEPS continuum of support, which is where there are strategies that the school can use, etc. That we don't just jump straight to Velcro and an SNA to a child that's on the first day to come into school. And the SNA support will be available where the interventions are proven to be not working. And as I said, some of the strategies can be what's called co-teaching or team teaching, where there will be, instead of having all the hours which are one-to-one supports outside the class, they bring those hours into the class, and you almost have what I refer to as 2 teachers in a class acting almost like a tag wrestling team, where one is up the top of the class like this, and I've seen this where the other teacher walks around and talks to the students, sees where the difficulties are, and tries to help them feel that they're still in a position to keep up with their learning experience in the class. Because some of the behaviour that emerges, in particular for students as they get older, is they feel that they're becoming more and more detached from the whole classroom environment, and the only way they can kind of gain attention is by acting out, etc. And I saw it particularly in a school in Cork at second level, where they had, by bringing the teacher into the class, they had managed to remediate behaviour hugely, and in fact improve the outcomes, the tests, etc., the results, because the students were more engaged in the learning process. But the SNA support is there and it's available, but what we're saying is once it's proven to be actually the support that's required, rather than the class teaching or the upskilling of the teachers, etc. So it doesn't automatically go in on day one for junior infants, where the care need is behavioural supports or related to behaviour. The circular also said that, or referred specifically to support for students with a visual or hearing impairment, because it recognised that there's a level of need there where the SNA plays a very sort of important role. And it provided clarity around this aspect of the SNA support, which is to enable students to access the curriculum. And it was a bit more specific in terms of the role of the SNA in that regard, as you can see, in relation, for example, to the preparation of braille materials or access to peer interaction and curriculum participation. So there's a particular role particularly in special classes for students with a visual or hearing impairment, or in the special schools, and we have students in mainstream as well, but that's recognised in the circular, and it makes things easier, I think, for both schools, for ourselves, and for parents to know that there are areas in that regard in which SNAs can provide a valuable support. I'm not going to go into the SNA allocation process too deeply. Noelle will deal with that. We are moving towards an annual allocations process. This is where the department are looking at providing certainty to schools at the beginning of a year, because I'm going back to around 2004-2005, we would have been allocating to schools for the 1st of September, but then we would have probably been in schools around October, November, and levels of SNA support adjusted in schools, and it could have adjusted upwards or downwards. In the downwards cases, it meant then that it provided sometimes schools with a headache, because they almost had to reconfigure and replan how their whole SNA, we call it the SNA timetable, had to be reworked for the rest of the school year. And so there was kind of particularly with the capped environment, we were trying to provide a greater level of certainty to schools, and then we would identify where resources might be freed up towards the end of a school year, and we'd implement that change at the start, should I say, of the following school year. It also, as I said, meant that the school could then develop a plan, knowing that unless the student left the school, by and large, the level of support was going to be left in the school for the rest of the year. But as I said, Noelle will give you a wee bit more information on that. The circular is talking about moving towards a time-bound allocation, because it is recognising, and I think the last figures in our annual reports would have shown that there was, I think, in the region of 25,000 students in schools with special educational needs who have access to SNA support. And the rough breakdown of that would be, just off the top of my head, would be about 7,500 would be in special schools. There'd probably be in the region of about 3,500 in special classes. And then there'd be about 15,000 or so, 16,000 in mainstream settings. And what I suppose that should show is that the SNA scheme has been really valuable in assisting the inclusion of students in a mainstream setting, because it's fairly certain that a lot of those students might not be actually educated in a mainstream setting, only that the SNA support is there to enable the care needs to be met, to in turn enable the learning needs, which are the main needs of the students, to be met in the school setting. Because we can't forget that students are in school to be educated, not necessarily purely to be cared for. And the balance between that care and education is what we're constantly working with the school to ensure that they don't sort of over-focus on care needs and not focus enough on the education needs. And that's why that planning process, that personal pupil plan, will be so important, because it'll begin to outline what targets will be sort of set for the school year. And in some cases, if they're not met, it doesn't mean that there's a failure on the part of the school. It might mean, for example, that there was an input of speech and language therapy that was required, or occupational therapy, and if that wasn't accessed during the course of the school year, it may have had a direct downstream impact in relation to how those targets could be met. So the annual review then, the circular is also talking about an annual review of allocation, because we recognise with the numbers I just outlined, say the 26,000, we'll be doing our figures for the next annual report, and I expect to see an increase in the numbers on what I'm saying to you this morning. But with that number of students accessing SNA support, there are three dynamics at play. There's students coming into school for the first time, there's students leaving school, and then there's students in the school who are developing a greater level of independent living skills. So there's quite a difference in terms of the level of care support that might be required in a school year on year. And if you take it, for example, a small school down the west, for example, in a rural community, you might find that the 1 or 2 students in that school who have access to SNA support will move on to another school. They might move on to a second level school. And some of you may have heard, or may have been listening to the radio this week. There was actually quite a bit about SNAs in the media this week, and I think there were schools in Cork mentioned. And I was talking about how levels of SNA support had gone down in the school, had been cut, is what they were saying. The reality of the situation was that the level of students accessing SNA support had changed in the school. A number of students had left. They'd gone on to the second level schools. But what wasn't sort of clear from the report, and perhaps we didn't make it clear enough, was that the students who had left had access to SNA support in their second level settings. So the support had moved to follow the need. And that's what we're always trying to do, to make sure that where the students are is where the allocation is made to meet that need. It doesn't always sort of come true in the process. But we also have an appeals process, which is there for schools to appeal the level of SNA support that they have, because if they feel that it's not working and that it's insufficient for either the number or the profile, number of students or the profile of the care needs of those students, they can appeal that. Parents can appeal the non-access to SNA support. So if your child is refused access, there's an appeals process there. But what we would hope to do is to try and sort of outline clearly why that decision has been arrived at, so that everybody understands it. And it may be, as I said, back to the views as to what the SNA scheme is for. The department did a review of the scheme back in 2011. It was called a Value for Money and Policy Review. All areas of public expenditure are subject to a value for money review. And just to kind of give you a sense of the extent of the amount that's spent on the scheme year on year, the SNA scheme costs, I think, in the region of about €350 million each year. So the review confirmed that the scheme objectives were being met. In other words, that the care needs of the students were being met through the scheme. It also signalled that the scheme was, to some extent, moving away from its objectives. In other words, that there were other duties, functions, whatever you want to call it, being carried out by SNAs, which were not part of the scheme, but which were, to some extent, eating into the allocation of SNA supports to schools. And when I go back to the capped environment where we only have a finite amount of SNAs, our job is to ensure that that's allocated to meet the care needs, not for other needs that the school might consider should be met through the scheme. It also clearly identified that there was confusion over the scheme and that there was a need for restatement of it, and that's why that circular issued, because the department then put out a circular in fairly clear language as to what exactly it does. It talked about possibly doing a cost-benefit analysis. And what it means by that is that, going back to the figure I mentioned, the €350 million, there was a proposal, or there was a suggestion made in it, that if some of that could be ring-fenced and perhaps put into more psychological services in schools, or perhaps more therapy supports for the students in schools, would you get better bang for your buck? Because in some cases, in all honesty, some of the SNA supports are there to reflect the fact that some of those supports are not being accessed. And so it was just making that point that, I mean, you could perhaps get you could have better interventions. It wasn't saying that the SNA support isn't needed, and I don't want people thinking I'm here to sort of bash SNAs. The SNAs are a valuable part of the education sector supports to schools. It was just making that very point. It talked about the Velcro versus the helicopter approach, and what that basically means is that when the scheme was set up, the SNA was effectively just tacked straight on to the student. They sat beside him, they followed them around the yard, they went everywhere with them. And that, to a certain extent, prevented a young child mixing with other students in the class or in the school, because particularly at second level, students don't want to be around adults, and if there's somebody walking around after you, etc., it can sometimes impair the capacity of that student to make friends, to develop their own independent living skills, etc. The helicopter approach that they were talking about was that you hover, you kind of keep an eye on things, you intervene when necessary. Sometimes the student mightn't even know you're there for them. You know, so that was what it was kind of talking about. In some cases that's feasible, in some cases it's not. But it was just saying that that is an approach which can, and in fairness, is being adopted in a lot of schools. It also said, going back to what I said earlier, that it could result in learned helplessness, which means that if, like any student, if they can't start developing themselves, if things are always being done for them, they'll never learn to do them themselves. And social isolation. In other words, if a group of kids were beginning to play in the yard and they weren't part of that dynamic because the SNA, they were constantly with the SNA, it could have resulted in certain situations where they weren't part of that social dynamic, the class dynamic, you know. So it just sort of pointed to these things, not as being endemic, but actually being sort of outcomes or features of the way the scheme was being run. It said then like that there needs to be a better understanding by parents of the scheme, and that's one of the reasons we were glad to come here today, to try and give you some sense of it and deal with some of the questions you may have. It also said that there was a need for better planning and use of supports. So, in other words, it's not just we have a problem, let's solve it with an SNA. It's that we have a child in a school who requires to be educated. There are significant care needs. We need to look at the whole issue that needs, the whole needs of that student, how we'll address the needs so that the education will happen. It also said then that the scheme has continued relevance. There's no question of this scheme sort of being shut down or anything like that. In fact, I'd argue it's very well embedded in the education system. But there's the question as to how that scheme will sort of continue into the future, and that everybody understands what you might call the limits or the parameters of the scheme, so that everybody can sort of talk about the same thing. So that's basically it. I hope I haven't gone on too long. I'll pass over to Noelle. Noelle is the head of local services, as I said. She's responsible, all the CNOs work to her. She's responsible for the allocation supports to schools, and she'll outline to you precisely how then the NCSE operates the scheme. Thank you very much.